The whole idea of customizing language is how language is used in political ways. We saw that we could put together something about art and text, but also about artists that work with political issues. I think Selene and I, we've always been interested in this interaction between language and art.
We're thinking about art customization, we're thinking about customs for the immigration and crossing, and also just like the adaptability of language and also how the artists work. We were always conscious, even though it wasn't like one of our main goals, we were always conscious of the gender balance, and we ended up having 5 and 5, 5 female artists and 5 male artists. And I think that every decision, even if it's not like in your face, I think every decision that you make is political. I think a lot of people have mentioned, and just because they know us, that it's a Latin American art show because artists are Latin American. But to me, it's a local show because they all live either in LA or Tijuana, except for Regina and Alexander Apostol. But I think it's reflective of the demographics of the city.
I also think that the fact that most of these artists are local is also something to think about, and the fact that they're local, but many of them are also referring to issues that pertain to their own countries, but it's also about global issues, and the fact that many of them use Spanish as part of their works is also interesting.
I think the role of the curator is a creative one, but at the same time, a curator is almost like an accomplice or a collaborator with the artist. It's very important for a curator to also respect the intention of the artist and respect the art object. So it's like a two-way role.
In terms of what the exhibition means today, I think it's quite relevant considering the specific moment that we're living on, especially if we think about all the campaign for the political campaign that is happening right now. I think many of the artists that are in the show have works that are very poignant at this specific moment that we're living. The piece by Camilo, which is the one with the welcome signs. I mean, that one is referring to the issues of immigration and specifically to the issues of the Syrian refugees.
Text is not the same as language, and we've been using often, it seems to me that we're often here talking about the relationship between art and text, more so than art and language.
I will use the text when it's necessary, and I will not use it when I don't feel like it, because that's why I do the work that I do. So I can explore, and I can enjoy myself, and I can react and express myself, because I do want to communicate something.
I value art, and therefore I value language, and I think that art does not necessarily need to be an action if it functions as language, right? Ideas have a value in themselves. They don't need to, hopefully they will lead to action, but action in itself is not necessarily the idea.
In the books that are burned, we have one example here in the gallery, are also a metaphor of that practice of burning your own books, destroying your own books so that nobody finds you with them. And this book is a book about Cuba that to me is important to show here because it's a symbol also of US intervention in Central America, how Cuba became a word that could not be uttered in El Salvador in the 1980s during the war. And so the garden books, the clandestine gardens, are also part of that practice of having a book that you didn't want to burn because it was too dear to you, but you couldn't have in your house. San Salvador is a burial ground for all these boxes of Manteca Nieves with books inside. And I have a lot of friends that I have been interviewing, and I have asked them, and they don't remember exactly where they are. So they have been digging, and they have never been able to find their books because they buried them in such a hurry, and they were in a house that doesn't look exactly the way it looked then, etc. And so the garden pieces are a part of that.
My name is Galaporis Kim, and I'm an artist in LA. I mostly work with drawing and sculpture and language. Originally, I was born in Colombia, and then I moved here when I was 12. For the show at LACE, I made some drawings that were based on these undeciphered artifacts that are found in Easter Island. And the language there is called Rongo Rongo, and then there's about 24 different artifacts that have these texts that is undeciphered. I thought that if I drew all of the 24 artifacts and look at each individual letter, eventually I'd be able to know the whole entire language in itself. But I was thinking about how, because it wasn't a deciphered language, how it was abstraction. If you can't access the information, then the symbols just become open for interpretation. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting just to see, written language specifically as just codes. Like somebody decided that this was going to be a stand-in for this idea, and then everybody was like, yeah, I agree. Part of the interest with using the Rongo Rongo was that because it was used so long ago and the objects are so fragile, they're made out of wood, so then time just makes them deteriorate quicker, that nobody has access to what it means. So then in a way it was interesting to see how all of history sort of works the same way, where it's like, it's so long ago and somebody just decided to write the sort of story about what happened, and we only have that record, but how do we know that that is an official version or the truth when we were never there, nobody can access it, and then there's just sort of these constructions that other people make, right? It's interesting to think about history and artifacts as just more open-ended, It's just like, because nobody can access them really, like what makes an expert in something that they obviously were not able to know 100%, right? Because I feel like, to me, when you experience artifacts, they mean something specifically only to me. And when you imagine all these functions that it could have been, then they do become that. Anybody can figure out what it is.
Well, I'm Beatriz Cortez, and I am originally from El Salvador. There was a war in El Salvador when I was growing up, from the time that I was 8 or 9 years old till the time I left. It lasted 12 years, and it was a civil war, so it was a war that was between the military and the revolutionaries inside El Salvador. But it also was inserted into the Cold War, so it was a war that was being financed by the United States. There was a moment when the United States was sending about $1.5 million per day of military aid and other type of aid to El Salvador. But I didn't understand all the logics of the war until I left, and I was able to think about it from afar. It impacted my work quite a bit, because growing up in a war meant that I had all these things to deal with. On the one hand, all these memories. On the other hand, that feeling of I didn't migrate because I wanted to. I migrated in a hurry, in a couple hours. I didn't have any time to pack. I didn't get to see my grandpa anymore. I didn't get to go back to my home. I soon realized that I didn't want to make work that was building memory in a way that solidified identities, because my work is all about removing those identities, imagining ourselves being other, imagining ourselves as part of the cosmos. So one of the big problems that I've been facing is how to build memory for the future, how to build memory that's not about solidifying these identities. And so that has been a really interesting challenge for me, and one of the things that drives my work, how to think about the past and how to build memories about the past that are really about the future, that open spaces for us to imagine other possible futures. I think that's how my work ended up fitting into also a larger narrative that's linked to science fiction. My pieces that were part of the show at LACE, Customizing Language, were pieces that actually really resonated with the concept of the show. Some of them were about censorship, but then I also had fortune tellers like this one that we have here that were the result of my collaboration with different communities. One of them was a collaboration with an indigenous community of a Cachiquel origin in the town of Patsicia in Guatemala. And then the other one was a piece that was bilingual that contained the dreams for the future by different immigrants. Inside of it, that box contained the dreams for the future that that community had. When I asked them what they wanted for the future and if they could have anything, what would they want? A lot of their desires were in the negative. There will not be genocide. We will not be humiliated. We will not be murdered. By printing in Cachiquel, Spanish and English, there was also this juxtaposition of the languages and the colonial dimensions of the languages. And I had written those dreams using the perfect tense in the future. So for example, that it would create collective, nomadic subjectivity, but it was written in the future perfect. So it says, for example, when the future comes, we will have met our relatives in person. When the future comes, we will have abandoned our prejudice. When the future comes, we will have organized, for example. And so then it talked about their desires, but it invited the viewer to become part of that nomadic subjectivity of the future.
That piece is by Clarissa. Those are molds of her own mouth while she's saying the vowels in Portuguese. But the molds are made of sugar. There's different types of sugar, so some of them started to melt throughout the exhibition with the heat. And it's a piece that also is talking about colonialism. The fact that she's using sugar, it's because sugar is a very important part of the trade that happened with Brazil during the colonial period. And language is also part of the colonialism. If we think about Latin America, Portuguese in Brazil, for example. So she's making reference to all these different aspects throughout that work.
Yeah, I think it's a very LA show. Yeah, if I can say that. And also like that issue of translation and mistranslation. In the city, you see the big billboards that, depending on which region you are in LA, are in Vietnamese or in Spanish. I feel like a lot of the politics that are in place, or like the system, doesn't allow us to have like a real connection with each other. And still a lot of communities are very like separated and segregated. I think that because we're in LA, we're very lucky that we have those blends of cultures, but sometimes they're limited to, oh, I eat like pho, and you know, like you don't really experience the culture. You experience it through food, which is amazing, but at the same time, I always question, like, is there a real mix of, or cultural exchange? I think it's still we're not there yet, unfortunately.